As the holidays get closer, that thought probably pops into your head. Am I getting a Christmas bonus this year? And then the bigger question, is that bonus something you're actually entitled to? Or is it just a nice surprise from your boss? Well, the answer to that is kinda complicated. It's all tied up in some fascinating legal history. So let's dive in and untangle it. So let's get right to it. Is that Christmas bonus a guaranteed right, something you can actually demand? Or is it just a generous gift you have to hope for? This isn't just some casual water cooler debate. This very question has been fought over in the highest courts.
Believe it or not, back in 1956, this exact question turned into a massive legal showdown. And I mean massive. It went all the way to the Supreme Court of the Philippines. And the decision they made back then? Well, it still affects paychecks even today.
Okay, so let me set the stage. This is the story of the workers versus the company. Specifically, a group of workers led by a man named Primitivo Ansay against the National Development Company. It sounds like a pretty standard labor dispute, right? But the real story here, the real drama, came from this incredibly interesting legal twist they tried to use.
So here's what happened. The Christmas bonus for 1954 comes and goes. Nothing. Then 1955, same thing, no bonus. Now the workers felt like they were owed that money. This wasn't just a gift in their eyes. So by July of 1956, they'd had enough. They filed a formal complaint, demanding a 20% Christmas bonus for those 2 years they missed.
All right, so the case lands in a lower court. But the company? They didn't waste any time. Right out of the gate, their lawyers hit back with a motion to dismiss. Basically, they were trying to get the judge to just throw the whole case out before it could even get off the ground.
Now, what's interesting is the workers' first argument. It wasn't really based on some specific legal statute. It was more of a moral argument, a simple appeal to fairness. But, as you can probably guess, the court saw things in a very, very different light.
And this quote from the court's decision really says it all. The court called a bonus an act of liberality. That's a fancy way of saying it's an act of generosity. And their point was, a court has no power to command someone, or some company, to be generous. It's just not what they do.
So the court's reasoning was actually pretty straightforward. Point 1, a bonus is legally considered a gift, not a right. Point 2, you can't force someone to give a gift, right? And here's the kicker. Because the workers themselves had called it moral obligation, the court basically said, look, our job is to enforce legal obligations. We have zero power to enforce something that's purely moral. And just like that, case dismissed.
But that wasn't the end of it, not by a long shot. The workers lost that first round, sure, but they were not giving up. They refused to accept that decision. So they did what you do when you're determined. They took their fight to the next level. They appealed the dismissal all the way up to the Supreme Court.
So for this appeal, they knew they needed a new game plan, a much stronger legal argument. And their last hope, their Hail Mary pass, really, rested on this very specific, kind of fascinating legal concept, the difference between what's called a civil obligation and a natural obligation.
Their new argument went something like this. Okay, maybe the bonus isn't a legally enforceable obligation, but it is what the law calls a natural obligation. Now, this was a pretty clever move, a really smart strategy, but there was a huge catch.
So what on earth is a natural obligation? Well, according to the Civil Code, it's a duty that's based on equity and natural justice. Think of it as what's morally right, rather than a specific written law. But here's the most important part, the detail you cannot miss. It does not give you the right to take someone to court to force them to do it. And this phrase from the law, from Article 1423, is everything. It says a natural obligation only matters to a court after someone has voluntarily paid up. Let me say that again. A court can't make them pay. But if they do pay on their own and then maybe try to take it back, then a court can step in and say, nope, you have to let them keep it. Looking at them side by side like this makes it super clear, right? A civil obligation is based on actual law, and a court can drag you in and force you to pay. But a natural obligation, that's based on fairness, and a court absolutely cannot force you. The only power it has is to authorize you to keep what was already voluntarily given to you. It's like a legal catch-22 when you think about it. For the workers' argument to even have a chance, a few things had to happen in order. First, you have to establish that the company has this natural obligation. Okay, step 1. But then for step 2, the company has to voluntarily pay the bonus. Only then, for step 3, can a court step in if there's a problem. See the issue? And that, right there, was the fatal flaw in their entire appeal.
Step 2, the voluntary payment, it never happened. In fact, it was the exact opposite. The company had refused to pay. That's the whole reason they were all in court to begin with.
So with that whole legal framework laid out, the case finally reached its last stop, the final destination, the Supreme Court. This is where the question was going to be settled, once and for all. Now, the Supreme Court didn't just pull this out of thin air. They looked back at previous cases, at precedent. They leaned really heavily on a case called Philippine Education Co., which had already ruled that a bonus is not demandable unless it's literally written into your salary. They did look at another case, the Heacock case, where a bonus was granted based on fairness, but they decided, nope, the situation here is different, so that one doesn't apply.
So the court's final logic was incredibly direct. They said, look, the workers couldn't prove this bonus was a part of their regular salary. And if it's not part of your salary, the court's ruling was clear. It is not a legally demandable obligation. End of story. Plain and simple.
And here you have it, the final word on the subject, straight from the horse's mouth, the Supreme Court itself. Their decision couldn't be clearer. From the legal point of view, a bonus is not a demandable and enforceable obligation. That's it. That's the ruling.
So, the final verdict was in. The workers' appeal? Denied. The Supreme Court completely agreed with the lower court's original decision to just dismiss the case. For Primitivo Anzay and all his fellow workers, the long fight was finally over.
That 1956 case set a really powerful legal precedent. But it does leave us with a tricky question, one that's super relevant today, right? If a company gives out a bonus every single year, year after year, so consistently that it just becomes an expected tradition, at what point does that so-called gift start to feel a lot more like a right? The answer to that one, well, that's still being argued about in offices and workplaces all over the world.